They laughed when Everett Marsh started hauling pipe across his back pasture in the middle of July. Laughed when the flatbed truck came a second time, loaded with PVC sections and gravel bags and things the neighbors couldn't name from the road. Laughed when they saw him out there at 5 in the morning, before the heat had a chance to settle, digging by hand in the red Oklahoma clay, while his old yellow lab stood at the edge of the hole watching like a foreman who didn't trust the work to get done without him. Nobody asked what he was building. They didn't need to. In Harlan County, a 72-year-old man who lived alone and talked mostly to his dog was already a kind of answer. The question just depended on who was asking. His name was Everett Marsh, and he had come back to his grandfather's land after 31 years away. 22 of them spent in the army, the rest spent trying to figure out what to do with the silence that followed. He had been a civil engineer before the service and a civil engineer after it, mostly water systems, mostly in places where water didn't come easy. He had built collection systems in the Sahel and pressure tanks in rural Honduras and slow sand filtration beds in villages that had never had clean water in recorded history. He had done it quietly, without recognition, which was the only way he knew how to do anything. He had come back to Harlan County because his grandfather's house was still standing, and nobody else wanted it. And because at 72 he was tired of going places. That was the whole of it. He brought 2 duffel bags and a dog named Copper, and he expected very little from the world in return. Copper was 11 years old, a big golden lab with a gray muzzle and a slow, considered way of moving that made him look like he was always thinking something through. He had been with Everett since Fort Bragg, technically a facility dog back then, assigned to a transitional housing unit Everett had been consulting on. When the project ended and no placement was found, Everett had driven Copper home in the front seat of a rental car and never discussed the matter with anyone. He was his dog now. That was the whole of it. The neighbors on Ridgeback Road had opinions about Everett from the first week. He kept odd hours. He ordered unusual equipment online. He didn't stop to wave when people slowed on the gravel road. His fence line, which his grandfather had let go to rust and lean, stayed exactly as it was, leaning, rusting. Because Everett did not consider a leaning fence a problem that needed his attention, he had bigger things in mind. The man 3 properties down, a younger fellow named Dennis, ran a small cattle operation and considered himself something of a spokesperson for the road. He had told his wife in April, when Everett first moved in, that the old veteran seemed like the type who talked to himself. He had told her in May, when the first delivery truck came, that he hoped Everett wasn't planning to start a business out there. He told her in July, when the digging started, that whatever the man was building, it was going to be an eyesore. He told her all of this at the mailbox, loud enough to carry. Everett heard him. He didn't respond. He just called Copper over, and the 2 of them walked back toward the pasture, together, the old dog matching his pace to the old man's without being asked. The summer had been bad. Even for Oklahoma, which had a long memory for bad summers, this one was different. The rains that usually came through April and into early May had stopped in March and not returned. The stock ponds were down. The grass had gone yellow and brittle before the 4th of July, which was weeks ahead of when it should have. The county extension office had issued 3 separate drought advisories. People were getting nervous in the way that people get nervous when they've been watching the sky for weeks, and the sky keeps giving them nothing. By late July, 2 of the 5 houses on Ridgeback Road had wells that were running low. Dennis's stock pond had dropped nearly 4 feet. The water table in that part of the county sat in a clay-bound aquifer that responded slowly, and everyone knew that once it dropped past a certain point, it didn't recover until the following spring at the earliest. Everett knew this too. He had known it since February, when he had pulled the county hydrogeological survey and spent 3 evenings with it at his kitchen table, Copper asleep at his feet, reading the contour lines and the permeability ratings and the old recharge zone maps that nobody had updated since the 70s. What he had seen in those maps was a secondary aquifer, shallower than the primary, fed by a different watershed, largely ignored because it sat beneath a stretch of caliche hardpan that made drilling expensive. Most wells in the county were drilled past it to reach the primary. But Everett had spent enough years working in difficult terrain to know that expensive was not the same as impossible, and that a secondary aquifer, properly tapped with the right collection system, could hold more than enough water for a small rural road through a dry summer. He had not told anyone this. He hadn't been asked. The pipe he was laying was a French drain system connected to a slow-release collection basin, fed by 3 hand-drilled points into the secondary aquifer, and a surface collection network that would catch any rain that did fall and send it underground, rather than letting it sheet off the hardpan and evaporate. It was not complicated work. It was just patient work. The kind that looked like nothing from the road and looked like everything once you understood it. Copper understood, in his way. He sat at the edge of each trench as Everett worked, ears forward, occasionally nosing at a section of pipe before stepping back to let the work proceed. When Everett stopped to rest, which he did more often than he used to, and in shorter increments, Copper would settle beside him and put his big gray head on Everett's knee. Just the weight of it. Just the reminder that someone was paying attention. Some evenings Everett would sit on the tailgate of his truck out in the pasture and explain what he was doing, the way he used to explain projects to junior engineers. He would describe the permeability coefficient of the secondary aquifer and the expected yield per day under current conditions. And Copper would sit there with his amber eyes half closed, listening, or appearing to listen, which, Everett had decided, was close enough. He worked through August. The second delivery truck brought a storage tank, 6,000 gallons, buried at the low point of the property, where gravity would feed it from the collection arms. The third truck brought a hand pump and fittings, and a secondary pressure line that Everett ran along his fence to a standpipe at the road edge, just inside his property line. He capped the standpipe and did not explain it to anyone. By the time school started in September, his well pressure was stable. His garden was producing in soil that his neighbors' gardens had given up on in June, and the oak tree in his front yard, the one his grandfather had planted in 1958, was still green when everything on either side of his property had gone the color of straw. Dennis noticed. He did not say anything to Everett, but his wife did mention it at the hardware store, and the hardware store clerk mentioned it to the man who delivered propane. And, by the second week of September, it had traveled the full length of Ridgeback Road and back again. Still nobody asked. The dry spell that had been a drought became something worse in the third week of September. The county issued a Stage 3 water restriction, which meant no outdoor irrigation, no car washing, limited fill for livestock tanks. 2 families on the far side of the ridge had their primary wells go dry without warning. The county emergency management office opened a water distribution point at the fairgrounds, and people lined up there with 5-gallon jugs in truck beds, faces tight, not saying much. Dennis's well dropped below the pump intake on a Thursday morning. He discovered it when he went to run water for his cattle, and nothing came out of the tap but air and a grinding noise. He stood in his barn for a long time staring at the pump housing. Then he went inside and told his wife, and she sat at the kitchen table very still, and neither of them said much for a while. He had 300 head. Without water, he was looking at a trucking bill to haul water in, or a trucking bill to haul the cattle out. Either way, it was money they didn't have in a year, when they hadn't had money to begin with. He thought about calling the county. He thought about calling his brother-in-law, who might lend him a tank. He drove out to the end of his driveway and sat with the engine off and looked down the road toward Everett's property, where the grass along the fence line was still green and the big oak tree in the yard was still throwing shade, and where there was a standpipe at the road edge that he had never once seen anyone use. He sat there for a long time. Then he drove back to his house and made himself dinner and did not do anything about it that night. The next morning, after he had checked on the cattle and confirmed that the situation had not improved, he drove his truck slowly down Ridgeback Road and turned into Everett's gravel drive. He got out. He stood next to his truck for a moment, not sure what he was doing. Copper came around the side of the house first, moving at his slow, considered pace, and sat about 6 feet from Dennis and looked at him, without particular hostility or enthusiasm. Then Everett came around the same corner, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at Dennis for a moment. He did not look surprised. "You're well," Everett said. It was not a question. Dennis nodded. Thursday morning, Everett folded the rag and put it in his back pocket. He looked at Copper, who had not moved. "Come on," he said, and walked toward the back of the property. Dennis followed him through a gate and across a pasture that was still producing grass. Actual green grass, not the tawny nothing that covered every other parcel on the road, and down to a flat area where a hand pump stood over what looked like a concrete access lid. Beside the pump was a spigot and a length of garden hose on a reel. "Secondary aquifer," Everett said. "Most wells around here bypass it. It's at about 40 feet, harder to reach, but it's not connected to the primary system, so it hasn't been drawn down the same way." He looked at Dennis steadily. "It'll give about 200 gallons a day off this one point. I have 2 others. Combined output is closer to 600. Dennis stared at him. "You drilled 3 wells, collection points, different than wells legally. Doesn't require a permit under the county threshold." Everett paused. "I'm not telling you that to be smart about it. I'm telling you so you know I did it correctly." Dennis looked at the green pasture around him. He looked at the standpipe he'd noticed at the road edge, the one he'd spent 2 months trying not to think too hard about. "That pipe at the road," he said. "For the neighbors," Everett said. "When they needed it, you knew we'd need it." Everett looked at him for a moment. "I pulled the hydrogeological survey in February. The primary aquifer was already showing a 12% drawdown from the previous dry year, combined with the La Niña pattern this spring." He stopped. "Yes, I knew." Dennis didn't say anything. The back of his throat felt strange. "You could have told someone," he finally said. Everett looked at him steadily. Not angry, not defensive, just looking. "Would you have listened?" Dennis opened his mouth, and then he closed it. Because he knew. He knew exactly what he would have done, what he had done, what he had said at the mailbox in May and in July and every time that delivery truck had come down the road. "No," he said, "I wouldn't have." Everett nodded once, as if that settled something. "The standpipe at the road takes a standard garden hose fitting. You'll want a pressure tank in your barn to manage the fill rate. It's a slow feed, not a fire hose. Get a 200-gallon tank on a float valve and run it overnight. That'll cover your cattle water with some to spare." He turned and walked back toward the house. Copper fell in beside him without being called. "Everett," Dennis said. The old man stopped. He didn't turn around. "I'm sorry," Dennis said, "for the things I said." There was a pause, long enough that Dennis wasn't sure he'd be answered. "I know," Everett said, and kept walking. By the following week, the standpipe had a line of trucks beside it every morning. Not just Dennis. The family with the 2 young kids at the middle of the road, the widow at the end who kept sheep and had been quietly hauling water from the fairgrounds for 10 days without telling anyone, the retired couple who had moved out from Tulsa 3 years ago and hadn't quite been accepted into the fabric of the road yet, and who stood a little apart from the others, unsure if they were included, until Dennis waved them over. Everett came out each morning and showed them how to use the fittings, what flow rate to expect, how to sequence the fill so the tank didn't drop below sustainable yield. He was not warm about it in an obvious way. He did not make speeches. He handed people instructions he had typed out the night before on a sheet of paper and answered questions precisely and without embellishment. Copper was warm enough for both of them. He made his slow rounds among whoever was standing in the driveway that morning, accepting scratches behind the ears, pressing his big head briefly against the knees of the 2 young boys from the middle house, who were always there with their mother, and who had immediately determined that copper was the most important thing on Ridgeback Road. They were not wrong. The woman from the middle house. Her name was Annette. Her husband was working offshore and wouldn't be back until October, had started bringing muffins on Tuesdays. She left them on the porch railing without making a thing of it. Everett did not comment on them directly, but they were always gone by afternoon. The retired couple from Tulsa, Roland and Faye, as it turned out, had a son who worked in water resource management for the state. When Roland mentioned this to Everett one morning while waiting for his tank to fill, Everett's expression shifted in a way that was subtle but noticeable. He asked one question: "What division?" Roland told him. Everett nodded slowly and said he'd spent some time consulting with that office in the early 2000s on the Eastern District Recharge Zone project. Roland relayed this to his son that evening, and his son called back 20 minutes later, surprised, saying that project was considered something of a foundational document in the state water management community, and he'd always wanted to know who had done the field work. Roland told Everett this the next morning. Everett said, and helped him check the float valve on his pressure tank. Copper sat nearby and appeared to consider this an appropriate response. October came without rain. The county kept the water restrictions in place through the end of the month, and the fairgrounds distribution point stayed open. But on Ridgeback Road, things were different. The morning lines at the standpipe had become something that looked, from a certain angle, like a neighborhood. People who had lived 600 feet from each other for years and never had a reason to stand together, now stood together every morning for 20 minutes, waiting for tanks to fill, talking in the way that people talk when they're paying attention to each other for once. Dennis had started checking on the widow at the end of the road. Constance, 78 years old, who had not asked anyone for help in approximately 40 years, and did not intend to start now, but who had quietly accepted Dennis's offer to run her morning fill for her, so she didn't have to hitch her truck so early. He did not make a production of this, he just did it. Annette's husband came home from offshore in the second week of October, and immediately drove down to introduce himself to Everett, which he did by showing up with a case of Shiner Bock and saying he heard Everett had kept his family from having a hard fall. Everett accepted one beer and said the situation had been manageable. The man, whose name was Greg, sat on Everett's porch for 45 minutes and talked mostly about the offshore work, which Everett listened to without apparent boredom, while Copper lay between their chairs and accepted attention from both of them impartially. In the third week of October, Roland's son drove out from Oklahoma City. He was a quiet, precise man in his late 30s named Alan, and he came with a notebook and a set of questions about the collection system, the aquifer data Everett had drawn from, and the yield measurements Everett had been keeping since the system went online in August. Everett walked him through all of it. He showed him the logs he'd kept in a composition notebook: daily yield, pressure readings, estimated drawdown, projected recovery rate. Alan sat at Everett's kitchen table and read through it, and Everett made coffee and put it in front of him without ceremony. And Copper lay in the corner watching all of this with his amber eyes half open. "This data is extraordinary," Alan said eventually. He looked up. "Do you understand what this represents? There are 6 or 7 secondary aquifer formations in this county that haven't been characterized because the assumption was they weren't worth the access cost. But if this yield data holds up, it'll hold up," Everett said. He refilled Alan's coffee. "Mr. Marsh," Alan said carefully, "the state has a grant program for sustainable rural water infrastructure. Small community systems exactly like this. I'm not certain what the application process looks like for a private landowner who's sharing access informally, but I'd like to find out." Everett looked at him for a moment. "Whatever helps the road. Would you be willing to consult on characterization surveys for the other formations? It would be volunteer, at least initially." "That's fine." Alan looked at him. You built this in July. When did you start planning it? February, Everett said. And you didn't tell anyone. Everett wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. He looked out the window at the pasture, where the grass was still green, slow green, careful green, the color of something that had been tended over a long season. People don't always want to be told about a problem, he said. Sometimes they need to arrive at it themselves. Alan considered this. And if they'd arrived at it too late? Everett was quiet for a moment. Copper shifted in the corner, made a soft sound, settled again. That's the part you plan for, Everett said. You do the work anyway, and you have the standpipe ready, and you wait. Alan wrote something in his notebook. He stayed another hour, asking careful questions and receiving careful answers. And when he left, he shook Everett's hand and thanked him formally, which Everett acknowledged with a nod, and then the truck went down the gravel drive and turned onto the road, and the quiet came back. Everett sat on the porch steps. Copper came and sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, the way he always did when the energy of the day started winding down. The sun was getting low over the ridge to the west, throwing long shadows across the pasture, and the air had finally started to carry the first edge of real autumn in it, a change you could smell before you could feel. Well, Everett said to Copper. Copper yawned enormously. That about covers it, Everett said. The rains came in November. Not record rains, not dramatic rains, just the ordinary soaking rains of a Oklahoma autumn that had been delayed longer than anyone wanted. The creek at the bottom of the ridge ran again. The stock ponds started to refill. The county lifted the water restrictions 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, and the fairgrounds distribution point closed, and people drove past it on the way to other things and felt a complicated kind of relief. The standpipe at the edge of Everett's property stayed open. He saw no reason to close it. Christmas that year was the first time the people of Ridgeback Road had ever gathered in one place together. It was Annette's idea, held at her house, and she had called it a potluck and kept the framing casual, knowing that some people, one person in particular, would not come to anything that sounded like a ceremony or a tribute. She put nothing on the invitation about what the evening was for. She said it was just dinner. Everett came. He brought a covered dish of something nobody could immediately identify, but that turned out to be a Honduran black bean preparation he had been making since the 90s from a recipe a woman in the Copan region had written out for him by hand on a piece of notebook paper that he still had somewhere. It went quickly. Copper came with him, which the 2 boys from Annette's house had been counting on for weeks, and which they made immediately clear by arriving at Everett's truck door before he had fully stopped. Copper descended among them with the patience of someone who had always expected to be needed and had simply been waiting to be useful. Dennis gave a toast. He had not prepared remarks. He stood up with his glass, and then stood there for a moment, working out what to say, and then said only that he was glad they'd all gotten through the summer, and that he was glad for the people they'd gotten through it with. And he looked at Everett when he said it, and Everett held his gaze and gave one small nod, and that was the whole of it. Constance, the widow from the end of the road, sat next to Everett for most of the evening and talked to him about her late husband's service. He had been in Korea, a fact she mentioned rarely, which Everett understood, and Everett listened in the way he listened to things that mattered, which was without interruption and without hurry. When she stopped talking, he didn't immediately fill the silence, and she seemed to appreciate that. When they left, later than Everett usually stayed anywhere, he stood at his truck in the cold, and Copper sat beside him, and they both looked up for a moment at the sky, which was clear and enormous, and full of the kind of stars you only get far enough from a city, and high enough on a ridge that nothing is blocking them. The creek was running somewhere below them. He could hear it in the dark. He had spent 31 years leaving places, building things and moving on, fixing what was broken and handing it off to someone else, getting in a truck or a plane and going somewhere that needed him. It had been good work. He did not regret a day of it. But you could not spend 31 years leaving places without sometimes wondering what it might feel like to stay in one. He reached down and put his hand on Copper's back, and Copper leaned into it the way he always did, warm and solid and entirely unhurried, and the two of them stood there in the driveway under the stars for a while, before Everett said, quietly, "All right," and they got in the truck and drove the quarter-mile home. The oak tree his grandfather had planted in 1958 stood in the front yard, bare now, its branches reaching up into the dark in every direction. He had kept it alive through the worst summer in 2 decades. He intended to keep it alive a while longer.